In this video, we are going to discuss the basic structure of the highly tested multi-state performance test, or MPT tasks. This is important because remember, in large part with the MPT, the examiners are testing your ability to follow instructions and complete the task within the allotted time and your overall work product. Thus, when the graders grade your MPT, your task should look like the real thing. In other words, if you were assigned a memo, your work product should look like a memo would in real life. Thus, the purpose of this video is to give you some guidance on the structure of these highly tested tasks. We suggest you take time to memorize these formats. This is because when the examiners test a highly tested task, they usually do not provide much formatting guidance. They will expect that you know how to format these tasks. Whereas if they test an odd or wildcard task, they usually provide additional formatting guidance. So we are going to go over each type of highly tested task and discuss the basic formatting or structure of each. We have a one sheet that you can download if you want to see these formats in one handy sheet. We will start with the persuasive brief. First things first, when it comes to the task of a persuasive brief, if the instructions are general and they tell you to write the argument section of a brief, we suggest you start by writing the argument section and then the conclusion. If you have time, you can draft the caption and the headings for the other two sections, the statement of the case and the statement of facts, and then write omitted under them. Rarely the examiners expect you to draft the caption and all four sections. Additionally, if the examiners provide you with additional instructions, be sure to follow them. We are going to cover all parts of a brief, so in the event you need to draft them, you will know what to do. Lastly, be sure you include all of the required headings for each section, which is usually just the legal argument and conclusion. Starting with the caption, sometimes in your file, the examiners will give you a motion or the opposing party's motion and brief for you to look at. That's a great place to start. Use that as your springboard. So flip through your file, see if that exists, and if it does, just copy off of it. The only thing you would be changing is the name or title of your brief. But in the event you don't have something like that to work off of, this is what your caption should look like. At the top, you should note what state you are in, which is usually Franklin. Under that, you should note what city or county you are in, which again would come from your file. Then under that, you will insert the plaintiff's name, followed by the actual word plaintiff, and then versus defendant, where you would insert the defendant's name and have that followed by the word defendant. Next comes the title of your brief, which you would have this information from your task memo. So that is your caption. A caption goes at the very beginning of your brief. Finally, do not include the actual word caption on your MPT. That is just there to show you what the caption looks like. Once you have the caption done, you can move on to the actual brief. It has four basic parts. Before we discuss what those are, I just want to remind you that memos and briefs for MPT purposes do not have as many parts as the memos and briefs that you may have learned about in your legal research and writing class. Thus, it is important that you familiarize yourself with these formats so that you are giving the examiners what they want for bar purposes. The basic components of a persuasive brief for MPT purposes are statement of the case, statement of facts, legal argument, and conclusion. Many times the instructions provided on the MPT will tell you to only draft the legal argument. So again, following instructions is really important. This way you're not wasting time drafting something that they can't give you points for. And of course, if you do something they tell you not to do, it's going to be very obvious that you're not following instructions. As previously noted, usually the instructions require examinees to only draft the argument section of the brief. But in the event you have to draft all of the sections, when it comes to the statement of the case, the examiners will provide instructions on what they expect to see in that section. The next section is the statement of facts. This is similar to the statement of the case. Usually, examinees are not required to draft this portion of the brief, and if they are, the examiners provide additional instructions on what to include in this section. Next comes your legal argument. For each issue, you should separate them by separate headings. You should draw positive attention to these headings by bolding or underlining them. The headings should be persuasive, where you include the law and facts and your requested relief in a complete sentence. Under each heading, you will be following the rule, analysis, and conclusion format. This means you are extracting the rules from the library relevant to each issue, then you analyze them. This is where you apply the relevant law to the facts in an effort to persuade the court to reach the conclusion that you want. One thing to keep in mind, which can throw a lot of examinees off, is that not every issue is going to be analyzed in the exact same depth as the other. So for instance, you might have 4 cases, and 3 of the cases are dealing with 2 issues, but only one case speaks to the final issue. So that means your final issue is going to be a little bit shorter because there's simply less to say. And that's okay. Not every issue is treated equally on the MPT, just like in real life. Further, make sure you're not ignoring bad law. In your legal arguments section, you want to make sure that you're addressing the law that hurts your client's position by distinguishing it from your facts. The examiners expect you address the law that hurts your position, and you will lose points if you don't. Additionally, remember your job is to be persuasive. This is a persuasive brief, so you want to use persuasive language. You're trying to show the judge that yes, there is a law out there that contradicts our position, but you essentially want to show how your position is different and how that's not actually impacting your client's case. Finally comes the conclusion section. This is where you simply summarize the legal argument above, and you're reinforcing those conclusions that you reached. This is pretty short, just about 3 to 4 sentences in total. Let's continue to our next highly tested task, objective memos. Much like any other MPT task, you want your memo to look like it would in real life. Start by including the heading memorandum or memo. I suggest that you bold it. That way you are drawing positive attention to it. Next, you have the memo caption. This is the to, from, re, and date information. Make sure you do not actually write your name. I know sometimes that's a knee-jerk reaction to insert your name on the from line. But remember, you should be anonymous for grading purposes. So be sure to follow the instructions to know who you are for writing purposes and insert that name on the from line. The basic components of a memo are the introduction section, the statement of facts, the discussion, and the conclusion. You should include these section headings in your final work product. I suggest you use Roman numerals and bold and underline these. Starting with the introduction section first. This is where you want to summarize the purpose of the memo and your conclusion on the issue. This means when you are practicing MPTs, you will have this half done until your discussion section is complete and you know the conclusion. Once you finish the discussion and know the conclusion, you can come back to your introduction and complete it. Alternatively, you could wait to draft your introduction section last, after you have wrapped up your discussion section. As for the statement of facts, this is not always a necessary component of the task, so make sure you're following the instructions presented. If you're supposed to be including a statement of facts, this is where you're summarizing the relevant facts. I suggest you draft this after you craft your discussion section, because this way you'll have a better feel for those facts that are important, and you'll be able to do this more quickly. Next, the discussion section. This is where you're going to get the majority of your points. This is where you will have separate headings for the different legal issues, and you will follow the rule, analysis, conclusion format under each heading. Here, your headings do not have to be complete sentences where you apply the law to the facts to reach a conclusion, like you would for a brief. Rather, with a memo, they can be a word or a phrase. But you should still bold or underline these to draw positive attention to them. I already mentioned this, but be sure to draft this section first. It will make drafting the other sections much easier. Another quick tip that can be really helpful is to have the first paragraph of your discussion section be a roadmap paragraph. This is where you are laying out the applicable law from broad to narrow, usually what is at issue. This is helpful because it gives the grader a nice overview of what the discussion section will be analyzing. The last section of the memo is a conclusion. This is where you summarize the discussion and findings. This will be short, usually only a few sentences. Next, letters. Letters are also categorized as highly tested. There are two types of letters that we see, demand letters and opinion letters. The overall formatting of both is similar, so that is a plus. Starting with the demand letter first, the main components of this is the caption, introduction, body, conclusion, and closing. The body is where you will get the majority of your points. One thing I want to point out is that we have labeled these sections for you so you can see precisely what we are talking about and where they go. But when you write a demand letter, you do not want to include these headings in your final work product. Starting with the caption, you will notice it is factual information about the parties that you have to fill in. The date, the law firm writing the letter, the recipient, the subject line, and then who you are addressing the letter to. You will find all of this information in your file. There may be another letter in your file that you can more or less mimic in terms of information and format. But if not, be sure to memorize this. Next is your introduction section. This is short, usually only a paragraph where you tell the reader the purpose of the letter and basic information about the sender. We suggest you write this last. To give you a quick example, if you're writing a demand letter to opposing counsel or the opposing party, in the introduction section, you'd identify yourself as the lawyer for the other side and why you're writing them this letter. The body is the most important. In this section, you should use separate headings for the different issues that you address. You can bold or underline these headings to draw positive attention to them. These headings do not have to be complete sentences. They can be a word or a phrase. However, keep in mind the task. This is a demand letter, so your goal is to be persuasive. You are trying to get the reader to do what you want them to do. Under each heading, you will follow the rule, analysis, conclusion format. Within this section, keep in mind your audience. If there are legal words or phrases being used and the reader is not another lawyer, be sure to explain what they mean. Additionally, much like we discussed with briefs, be sure you address any bad law. You will be expected to address law that hurts your client's position and to explain why that bad law should not impact your case. Next is your conclusion. This is where you suggest your recipient do what you want. This is again kind of like outlining your demand. This is fairly short, about 3 to 4 sentences in total. Lastly, your closing section. This is where you sign the letter in accordance with the instructions provided. So for example, if according to the task memo, you are drafting a letter for the managing partner to sign, you would make sure the closing section reflects that. Moving on to our opinion letter. They look pretty similar to demand letters, as I previously noted. However, you should note that usually with demand letters, they are being sent to opposing counsel. Whereas with an opinion letter, you are usually sending the letter to your client. Usually the client asks you, their lawyer, a question. And in the letter is where you provide your response and opinion on the issue. That is the big difference between the two tasks. Turning to the sections of an opinion letter, this too starts with a caption. Given we just discussed what this is, I'll skip over it. Next, you have the introduction. This is the same as discussed with a demand letter. You explain the purpose of the letter and basic information about the sender. Be sure to write this last when you are more familiar with the relevant facts. For the body, you're going to do the exact same thing as you did for a demand letter. You should draft headings for the different issues you are addressing, and the headings should be bolded or underlined. You will then follow the rule, analysis, conclusion format under each. Next, the conclusion section is where you're going to conclude on those questions or issues presented and suggest any further action. So again, if you're drafting this to your client, this is where you're telling your client what to do or what they should do next. This is fairly short, about 3 to 4 sentences in total. Lastly is the closing section. This is where you sign your letter. So be sure to double check the instructions so you are formatting this properly. All right, we have just gone through the most highly tested MPT formats. Remember to memorize these formats and use them as a default in the event you are not provided formatting guidance. We hope you found this video helpful.